was actually cited in the Quran. Surah Al-Luqman is a citation, maybe from another source. Anyway, that's a detail. But why does the term aql, not occur as a noun in the Quran, whereas other major terms do, and it's always a verbal process? My understanding is that because aql was so central to old Arab ethos and understanding is in terms of prudential wisdom, that the wise men of the Arabs, and often the leaders, but they were worldly wise. They were the sages who knew how to navigate this world and how to maximize benefit for this life. The Quran has another horizon, it's an otherworldly dimension. So the Quran avoided that term because it didn't want to associate itself with the more profane, non-revealed type of intelligence or rationality that the Arabs knew and admired. Not that the Arabs were unrational before the time of Islam. In fact, even there's arguments, if you want, interestingly, about Islamic arguments that one of the miracles of the Quran is that it's so rational and it appeals to rationality and persuasion through argumentation, which is, in a sense, inherently a form of informal logic, and that this is one of its signs, whereas previous prophets had to perform miracles, otherwise people wouldn't believe them. But a miracle is a kind of an irrational proof, if you will, right? But the proof of the Quran was a rational proof, the language, and then the appeal to higher insight. And this is widely subscribed by early Muslims, and I think it's an important insight that the wisest and the smartest people among the Arabs were the ones who said the Prophet is bringing us something very important. They were able to understand, and the Quran appealed to their intelligence in that sense. So these are some of the factors that would go along with what you said. Maybe the zeal and the preference to make the Quran some kind of exceptional disruption in history is natural among Muslims, of course. But in another sense, it's not historically accurate, but this is not important to argue about, you see. But when you look especially at the doctrine of the ayat and the verses in which, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ and أَفَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, and you begin to realize that it fits into a pattern which is older and widespread than the Quran. But in the Quran recapitulates it at a higher level, or in a more purified way, if you will. So I would see it in that context. But this is a matter of historical development. It's not really germane to most Muslims. They take the Quran as the starting point. They don't need to go behind the Quran. Yeah. But historians of the history of ideas and thought would be interested to see what the confluence. And I don't mean the old-fashioned Orientalist thing that they try to identify the passages in the Bible and the Talmud where the Quran was imitating or quoting. That's not a valid approach either. Because now it's been shown by very careful research that so-called passages in Babylonian Talmudic tractates that were seen to be the source of certain Quranic verses, the understanding of the formation of the Talmud has now put the date much later than previously assumed. And some of these passages which were used to prove the Jewish origin of certain ideas are now being used to show the Quranic influence on Jewish thought, which is probably more historically accurate. And one sees this especially in the stories of prophets. In any case, these are side considerations. But I think it's good to take some of these questions into one's consideration as background. Maybe they have some way of showing us a different appreciation for the Quranic legacy. But from the point of view of an inner Muslim discussion, some of these questions don't need to be raised. Right? But when you come to a situation where you're talking to, let's say, a Christian thinker and a Jewish thinker, it's good to maybe remind ourselves. It's a healthy thing. Muslims need to be more exposed to that. They're not that used to it, you see. That's my understanding.
Yeah, good. Yeah, go ahead.
So the theme up till now is sort of how modernity has upended traditional epistemic categories and our idea of the intellect and reason and rationality. And I wonder if some of the thinkers that you've presented today reflect on how the Enlightenment, how modernity, and I know Descartes is a big influence on these thinkers, and then a lot of the pragmatists, they try to get away from Descartes. I'd like to hear, I guess, from the philosophers you quoted today, if you know about how they themselves relate to the very modernness of their thought and their reflections on it.
Are you asking how self-aware were founders of modern rationality, of the modernity of their thought?
In these empirical analytic philosophers.
Oh, okay.
I guess I just thought it might be helpful for everyone else to hear how they understand the uniquely modern aspect of their thought, their reflections on modernity and how it influences their views of rationality and reason.
Still, I'm not sure. I see the question. So, modern people in analytic.
What is modern about what you presented?
Okay, good. Okay. I don't know. I just assumed that perhaps I shouldn't have said. Did I say some modern ideas of rationality? No. So the ideas of rationality. I didn't mean that they are modern, but I meant that contemporary philosophers thinking of rationality this way or that way. So if this is legitimate to call them modern, so you can call them modern, but I'm not really sure that I have said that there is a modern conception of rationality versus pre-modern or ancient conception of rationality, and I just introduced a modern one. I'm not sure about this. I talked about contemporary debates on rationality, common views and perspectives. Does it mean that there are modern in a sense? I'm not sure.
Well, let me rephrase. Do the philosophers that you've raised to explain these ideas of rationality and reason, how do they understand the historical moment in which they're writing?
Good question. Let me think. Go ahead.
Do they view their thinking as conditioned in a certain way?
Okay, come back to the first one. I guess people do accept that we are, in some sense, imprisoned in different prisons. So that should be a platitude in our age, in our language, in our culture, in our time, in a word. That should be, I guess, in this vague sense, should be okay. Some of them perhaps would rely on modern achievements a lot, or more than others, in thinking about rationality. We were talking about Richard Rorty in lunchtime. We didn't talk about Rorty today, but his conception of rationality, science, and rationality as applied to human beings is different from others, and perhaps Rorty relies a lot on what we have learned from modern science and from new era that we are in. Some others perhaps. Okay, the people who are defending maximizing framework, I guess some of them think that this is the ancient conception of rationality. It comes from very...
and a lot of this is infused with Aristotle.
Yes. So some people...
As opposed to Plato, who's been the main figure.
Exactly.
Everything we've been discussing.
Exactly, exactly. So some of them take that well, rationality, because it seems that rationality in Plato, at least, I'm not really good at this, but it seems that rationality has a very different sense in Plato. It's not really about reason itself has a different sense. You know, it's not even clear that Plato is talking about a power or something like that. It's not a description of some processes or some age. It could be a description of some agent, but not in virtue of being a power that is possessed by some, not by others. Maybe Plato is using reason in a completely different sense. Maybe reason is, I don't know, reason is I have heard that I have heard that for Plato, reason denote or shows a word. It's like reason is not a power. Reason is a word. You have a word of reason. And in fact, in Islamic tradition, we have that influence, that we talk about reason, most notably in philosophy and theology, as reason occupies an important ontological status among things. Reason itself is an entity, or is a word. It's created in some sense. You know, we talk about that, and how much is this talk influenced by Neoplatonic tradition and others? We don't want to talk about that, but definitely what we can say is that there is a tradition of talk about rationality coming from Plato and Neoplatonic tradition that takes rationality in a completely different sense. And you are right that I did not talk about that today. And also you are right that we talked about the conception of rationality, which is more, it's closer to what Aristotle said in that sense. So that conception is modern, is not modern. It's modern because still some people think that even with all we have got from science and modern world, still that is the gist of modern rationality. And it's not modern because it's a tradition. You are right that it's narrow and one-sided in ignoring the other traditions, most importantly the Platonic tradition. So how, coming back to your question again, how do people in contemporary analytic philosophy, how do they see their position in history of thought and the influence of that position on their thinking? Am I right now in interpreting your question? Okay. Again, I think it's completely case-based. People who are very attached to the idea of happiness and satisfaction can take their origin back to ancient Greek and pre-Socratic tradition even. And people who are people who perhaps emphasize a lot on the machinery you need for maximizing framework. The machinery which is completely new, machinery that you get it from, mathematics, logic, probability calculus, and so on and so forth, perhaps see more weight on the modern side, that the ancient side perhaps, yes, has some idea, but really the idea is modern because the machinery you need to run it is completely modern. So, I think you should look at a specific author that you are, to see whether I'm not aware of any consensus.
Just from the ones you mentioned today.
I have not looked at them from this point of view. Yeah.
Rephrase Ezra's question, because I also have a similar question. Are the thinkers that we were discussing, are they consciously aware that the ideas about rationality, which came out of the Enlightenment and positivism and 20th century currents of thought are no longer adequate and they have to refine them or search for a new angle, or they think they're basically within the main framework of late modernity, which is a legacy of positivism and Enlightenment thought. You know, instrumental reason, you said they're kind of tweaking instrumental reason. They're improving it or refining it or extending it, but they're still wedded to instrumental reason. They're not trying to, well, when you get the idea of Zen virtues intruding, it's a little bit strange. I mean, do they read Heidegger? And I don't think they read Mullah Sadra, but some thinkers do actually. Or now they're beginning to read about Ibn Arabi and other so-called Islamic thinkers that can serve as food for thought for rethinking about human being and rational enterprise and stuff. Are they consciously stepping beyond the legacy of modernity, or they still see themselves as part of modernity, or maybe the late phase of modernity, which some people call hyper-modernity or liquid modernity or something? I don't know. No one seems to agree. But it's not the same as, say, as 150 years ago when positivism was absolutely the king and no one questioned. There were certain certainties. We have reached, we have solved, we have completed, but now all those certainties are gone. And we see that, you know, that the legacy of positivism brought our environmental crisis, our attitude towards nature. I mean, that's the heart of this idea of goal-oriented. And then our social and our financial worlds have been turned upside down also. And these are expressions of the way we rationalize our behavior and our organizing activity and our social and economic modes. Don't they realize that they're trying to break out of that mold, or they still see themselves as solidifying and working within that tradition? I probably confuse the issue even more, Ezra. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, actually, I have not been within the non-analytic tradition of philosophy, so I cannot judge about that part. As far as I can talk about analytic tradition, I think there are I think we should distinguish between two things. First, abstract discussion and study of rationality. Second, about the study of the ingredients significant in any theory of rationality. For example, the discussion about self, interest, maximizing, utility, preference, I put them in the latter category. Study of what rationality itself is, I put on in former category. I think first, analytic philosophers are most resistant people against what Karim mentioned about about changing the concept of rationality by looking at absolutely radically different models of rationality. They are hesitant. They are reluctant. They do not like to do that. The majority of them. The standard still, I think, is against that. So most people still think of rationality as maximizing. Most people try to make sense of utility, self, interest, and other things in such a way that this refinement can take care of the new issues we got. So this is my feeling of the scene. I think this is the mainstream. Some people have thought that new research, in particular in the last 10 years, shows us that maybe something much deeper is wrong. But there are minorities. Within analytic philosophy, there are minorities. And the major research programs, funds, and I think research and PhD programs, they focus, as long as they are talking about rationality, thinking about rationality, they think within the standard framework of maximizing in some sense. Well, perhaps you're not maximizing, but you're optimizing. You add limitations, but to the same picture, the same machinery. You you try to fine-tune that. But you don't want to just throw it out and take a new framework, a new paradigm of rationality. I think it's still people are not ready to do that, at least within the analytic tradition. But a lot has been done in North America in the last 2-3 decades. I mean, competing traditions, Islamic studies included, study of analytic philosophy, emergence of new young researchers, and they all changed the scene. Is now happening, but this is somehow isolated from the mainstream analytic philosophy. So mainstream analytic philosophy has somehow separated itself from these new trends of thought that are going on. This is my feeling. This is my feeling of what's going on.
Well, how about the findings of philosophy of mind or cognitive psychology, which is neurophysiologically based and has have much research and very particular focused work has been done for decades now. That doesn't interest analytical thinkers, but they don't try to acquaint themselves with that and use the results for their own thinking. I mean, there are people now who are working, they're studying Tibetan Buddhist meditation from the point of view of understanding what mind is. And there are medical doctors who deal with mental disorders and stuff who have written very interesting observations about what a healthy mind is or what reason really comprises, and the role of emotions in reasoning is something which is taken very seriously now and studied. It's not some crank, thing. Analytical philosophers are not availing themselves of these other fields and trying to widen their horizon, or they're still within their own sort of conceptual, domain, which is not penetrated by those other currents.
Regarding such research, no, they are open. In fact, I don't have the PowerPoint there. Can we turn it on? In fact, a lot has been done regarding, as you mentioned, regarding rationality and intelligence in neuropsychology, and people now, and even in computing science, people are thinking about what's the basis of reasoning. Yeah. So, no, as far as I know, people are open in analytic tradition, are open to discussions like that. The result has been kind of a strong wave that is coming now from those disciplines, attacking the standard conception of rationality and intelligence, but in a particular way. The way is not to push analytic philosophers toward alternatives found in Eastern, for example, religions. Rather, they are coming back to, as I mentioned about Stephen Stitch, they are coming back to revise their own tradition to make room for these anomalies. So, for example, Howard Gardner in 2006 published a book, Multiple Intelligences, in which the idea is that perhaps IQ is not a reliable means to talk about intelligence. So we need to have different forms of intelligence, and these different forms of intelligence should be measured in different ways. So there's no unifying test like IQ giving you the measure of intelligence. Also, there's a tension between philosophers like Stitch, Morton, Rorty, and others feel that perhaps we should give up on a unified conception of rationality. There's no such single conception. At the same time, they think that if the concept of intelligence requires such a unified notion of rationality, we should give up on that conception of intelligence as well. So there's a tension between this move and psychologists' move that they design a specific test to measure intelligence and define rationality in terms of intelligence. Rationality, in fact, is an intelligent way of getting what you want. A smart way of getting what you want. Okay, so if you have intelligence, you can define rationality. There's a kind of tension between them. On the one hand, they try to, well, Gardner still is not kind of mainstream. It's a new move just happening 5 years ago, 7 years ago. So one idea is that we should go toward a kind of pluralism about intelligence. Okay. The other one is to say, well, actually what psychologists are doing is not very different from what analytic philosophers, the new wave of analytic philosophers are suggesting, in the sense that some people think what actually psychologists are doing is not measuring the unified conception of rationality and intelligence. And this is why. To test something psychologically, you need to have a concrete experiment. To have a concrete experiment, you need to have robust, rigid conceptions of things. Okay, you should somehow make sense of how this agent in this particular test is, for example, relying on process A versus process B. And many of such things are subconscious, so you cannot rely on the report you get from agents. So you need to devise means to measure that. By doing this, you already fit some concepts into the experiment. You feed them in because this is the only way that you can make a concrete experiment. So in fact, what you're measuring is just a rigidified version of one particular process or capacity. There's no way from that to a very unified single conception of rationality or intelligence. So analytic philosophers think that, well, psychologists are doing something which is not probably wrong and doesn't clash with what we say the new wave says, because we are saying that you never get that unified conception that you expected. You just get different conceptions that each one works within its own domain. So they are open to that kind of a study, and this has moved them to either give a new understanding of psychological experiments, give a new conception of how to measure intelligence, run for multiple conceptions or multiple intelligences, multiple conception of intelligence or multiple intelligences. And also some of them, like Stitch, to argue that rationality does not play any significant role anymore, come back to knowledge and how we gain knowledge. This is what we should focus on. So, to short, long story, yes, they accept that kind of feedback, but still they do not take that kind of feedback as pushing them toward more religious conception of rationality. Does it make sense? No? Definitely not. Yeah.
It's interesting to understand because the valuable part of your contribution that Nusratullah gives us insight into the current state of privileged thinking. I mean, this is what they think is important and what they're spending their efforts on. And this is necessary for us to know. But maybe, as I also have this concern about